Okay, we're going.
Okay. Oh, we're ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're jumping in to today. What we're talking about is women in the Bible, probably more specifically the Old Testament, and talking about how the Bible talks about women. But do you want to give a quick explanation of what you talked about tonight and how maybe that relates? Maybe, like a 1 minute.
Yeah. So we jumped back in with Abraham's life tonight or last Wednesday, and basically saw that he makes the same mistake again. Like, he doesn't really truly trust God's provision. He makes the same mistake by lying about Sarah being his sister and puts her in a vulnerable situation again. And then through that, we end up asking, like, is Abraham going to face any consequences for what he's done? Because God keeps his promise to Abraham, blesses him with a son named Isaac, which is great. God always keeps his promises, but it also does create this tension of, like, well, when someone does something wrong, do they have to face consequences for it? Or does God just protect them all the time, every time? Like, are there any consequences for us when we do wrong? And then through that, we see the story of Abraham and Isaac confronts Abraham with the wrong that he's been doing, confronts him. And that really is the consequence in a lot of ways, is the emotional turmoil that leads up into what God asks him to do in giving up his son. And God has the right to do that because God's always upheld his end of the covenant, but Abraham has not. On more than one occasion. We're going to look at one of those other occasions today on the podcast. But what we see end up happening is even though there's a cost associated with what Abraham does wrong, God doesn't ask Abraham to take that cost. And he confronts Abraham with the reality of where his actions have led, but says, this isn't the way that you make yourself right with me, though. It's not by sacrificing your son. I'm going to provide another way. And in the meanwhile, he provides a ram, but we're also left narratively wondering what is the cost that has to be paid to be made right with God.
Awesome. Very excited about that. So yeah, given the stories and everything happening with Abraham and Sarah, I forgot because we were going to talk about Hagar and Ishmael today. Is that what you were referencing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Are we not talking about that anymore?
I thought we were talking about women in the Bible.
Oh, I thought we were going to use Hagar to talk about that.
But we'll see what happens. Maybe we will. Maybe we won't.
Okay, that's fine.
The hard part of the topic is when you talk about women in the Bible, they're half the gender, so there's just a lot to talk about.
No, there's many things to draw from.
So it's hard to know where to go.
Many confusing passages.
Yep.
about how women are treated in the Bible.
Yeah, a lot. And okay, that's helpful for me to remember. My mind was not there.
Yeah.
Oops.
Oh, that's okay. I'm curious now where we're going.
Yeah, I didn't have time to print out, so I'll just surprise you. So the first thing I wanted to do was, you know this because we talk about it often and you study the Bible a lot. But one of the things we have to do in reading the Bible is transport to a different culture and different world. Like if we were going to travel to, I'll give you an example. So when I was in seminary, we would have I think I've talked to you about this before. We have these like cultural, there's an apologetics class and it was like morality questions that were super tricky. And one of them, I think you'll remember this one. One of them was, say you go to this African tribe and you're coming to share who Jesus is. And you start to share and everybody starts becoming a Christian. And the tribal leader has 4 wives because that's the culture they lived in. And these women all had sex with that man because they're married. They are now unable to be married to anyone else. And he becomes a Christian. And the question is, should he divorce 3 of them? Because if he divorces 3 of them, they cannot get married. They have no one to take care of them in that culture. There's not a job for them to go do. There's not a house for them to go buy. There's not like a market or literally they will be put on the street, probably used, abused, hurt. Like their life will be horrible because this man abandons 3 women.
Right.
So do you leave a man married to 4 women, even though the Bible clearly teaches that it's 1 man, 1 woman? Or do you put 3 women out on the street? And like, what do you do in that situation? And the answer is like, I have no idea. Like, I don't ever want to be. And then I think I've told that once at MLT, and one of the pastors here was talking about missionary, and they're like, that's happening. There's a missionary group from Woodlands that's like dealing with that right now in one of the missionary. So it's not this crazy hypothetical that would never happen. It's like there is actually right now a Woodlands sponsored missionary walking through this situation. And so it can sound like a either clever or funny or whatever thing, but it's when you're the people in that situation, it's heartbreaking and hard.
Yeah.
But one of the big parts of it is when you go to a completely different culture and things are set up differently and they're not the way God wants them. We even talked about this with violence, my like pithy thing of, do you just make Adam and his family be like reformer, like all prison guards for a reform thing? And like, how do you move from a really broken world where nothing is as God wants it, or most things aren't, to one where God wants it? Like you can't just, move over one to one.
Yeah.
So like when we enter into this conversation about women in the Old Testament, part of what we have to do is remember that the way that they lived is so different than the way we lived. And so we're not trying to ask, remember the Bible's written for us, but not to us. So the things in the Bible are not like, hey, 21st century Christians living in middle-class America, this is what you should do to people. It's written to this world for a reason. In the same way that if, say, Woodlands wrote a letter to that tribal leader who's in that situation, I would not hand that letter to the husband and like I would hand it to Elijah, your husband, and say, here's some advice for you, Elijah. Like take this, just whatever. Very, very different context. So yeah, so that's like a frame. So there's this Old Testament scholar I was listening to, and she said this. She was describing the ancient world, and she said, life was hard, survival was uncertain, and family was absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And I have to continually remind myself, most children died. It was common for armies to come in and just take whatever they wanted and kill people. There was no government. There was no priests or pastors. There was no social services. If you lived in the ancient world that we're currently talking about with Abram and his wife and his family, Abraham was in charge of everything. Like if there was a problem, if there's a situation, he was it was a family unit that would protect themselves. So like to give you an example, another one I was thinking of was like if someone steals something, how do you handle that in the ancient world? There's no police to call. There's no like evidence to get. It's just like you go to the patriarch, and if they're from a different family clan, you would go to your patriarch to then go to their patriarch. And marriages were alliances between patriarchal families. Yeah. So if you're a father of a family unit, think extended family, not your like nuclear family, and you want to make your family even safer, what you do is you marry your daughters of your family unit to another family unit so that there's an alliance. And then that patriarch likes you because you've traded family, like your families are intertwined. Yeah. They see your family as theirs and vice versa. So now if somebody from his tribe steals from your tribe or hurts someone from your tribe, you can you have a connection. So it's all of these like really complicated, there's no social structures set up to protect people or care for them or to adjudicate justice or anything. But yeah, you know a lot of this. It's mostly for you.
Yeah, no.
But it's also like, it was a good reminder for me to like put my brain there as I'm thinking about women in the Old Testament.
Family is the structure to protect the vulnerable. Yep. Whereas we have other like man-made structures today that help protect vulnerable people.
Yep.
But in the ancient world, family is all you've got.
Yep. And so that goes to divorce. Like why was divorce and adultery such a big thing in the ancient world? And so imagine this situation where you're a patriarch and you're in charge of all of these people. And this was one of the helpful frames for me was this scholar was saying, people get really, really frustrated about the ancient world that women were not free to do what they wanted. They weren't free to go pursue a career or to whatever. They weren't free to do what they wanted, marry whoever they wanted, whatever. And her point was, neither were men. No one was free. Like our idea of being free to do what you wanted is a brand new thing. Yeah. And so she was saying, if you were a patriarch, you were responsible for the past, present, and future of your family. And that meant you were given something from the previous patriarch, and you had to give that to the next people. So she's like, you couldn't sell your land if you wanted. You couldn't move somewhere. You couldn't, you weren't free to do anything you wanted. So she's like, yes, women were not free to do whatever they wanted, but neither were men. No one was just free of family ties because family was everything. So an example I came up with in my own mind to try to illustrate this was, imagine you're a patriarch and you have a daughter in your family unit and you marry that daughter off to another patriarch to create goodwill and alliance, whatever.
Should we define patriarch?
Oh yeah, patriarch. Yeah, that's another good point. Patriarch and patriarchy now has come to mean offhandedly men abusing or being like powering over women, like ruling over them in an
or like
unfair
some
way.
kind of systemic power, set up so that men can just do whatever they want at the expense of women.
Yep. So it's entirely negative in our mind. In the ancient world, patriarchy just meant a man was in charge. And we'll get to why that probably was. Besides sin, there's some other reasons it probably was the case. So you have a patriarch, the man who's in charge of a family unit. So think like the great grandpa who's watching over everything and making decisions. The wisest, probably not actually wisest, but seen as the wisest of everyone. So he marries off one of the women, and he creates this alliance with a man, another family unit, and then that woman decides to go run off with another man outside that family unit. When you're thinking in terms of alliances and goodwill, all of a sudden, this whole other clan now lost something. And that's your family that did it.
Yeah.
They could attack, kill, cut off, trade. And so when that line, like life is hard, survival is uncertain, by somebody committing adultery or not going through, especially because the family unit was so important, anything like that could literally and did kill entire family units. Like it would jeopardize your whole, it wasn't like, oh, I shamed my family and now they don't go to this like, I don't know, family situation and we don't get to go to Christmases anymore because I did this, or they talk about me awkwardly when something happens. It was like the partners that we had for trade that would help us when famine hit, and we would all pool resources, and we lived in different regions so that some regions were safer than others. We just lost that connection. And now when a famine hits, we have nowhere to go and our whole family dies because this person went. And it was the same for men. Like, it was the same for men. And we'll get to that, but because of how it went through men, the women were the ones that left the family unit to go to a different family unit. And so that's why for women, it became a little bit more, I think specifically in law, became more talked about, was because the men were the ones still in the family unit. So that's some more context. So I was thinking a lot about this idea of men being in charge. And I think we'll get to this because I want to like kind of walk through the stories you've gone through far and think about like how it relates to women. What would you say if you had to like, I'm just putting you on the spot. Would you rather that, or I just don't want a monologue? Would you rather me put you on the spot? Or monologue?
Put me on the spot.
Okay. How would you think about or explain why or how men were in charge? Like, why was it the man?
I mean, a modern example that I would give today is like, generally speaking, physical vulnerability. That generally speaking, if a man wanted to come and beat me up or like whatever, I would not have a great chance in defending myself. Maybe I would. Maybe in like a physical encounter at least.
Yeah.
And in the ancient world, when that's how most encounters were handled, was just like a physical encounter. I would say it would be seen as maybe weak to not have a man be in charge for that reason. And probably
not even just seen as weak, but
like
literally
actually
would be.
Yes. And like a silly. Well, it's silly and not silly at the same time. But like a modern example is like I wouldn't go on a run at night. You probably, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's not like the smartest thing for you to go on a run at night, but you probably wouldn't have like nearly the same level of like trepidation about it as I would. And part of that's maybe just like narrative, like media narrative. I don't know. But or another thing is like
statistically.
Yeah. Well, yes, statistically, if I'm going to be overpowered by someone, it's going to be a man, and I'm at a greater risk of that happening than you.
And having a man present with you makes you far less likely. I mean, just being isolated in general makes you more likely to be attacked.
But also like the other example I give is like how many guys do you see walk around with like pepper spray on their keychains?
Well, they're normally packing if they're.
Well, yeah, I guess, but like, yeah, but every, I don't know. I had pepper spray on my keychain when I was a teenager.
Well, where I go to when I think of this is two different things that relate. One is America and Western media has this fascination with everyone's ability to do everything. And this idea that like, even like movies of like martial artists or fighting or whatever, where it's like the underdog wins, this thing of like the idea that like a small, tiny woman would be able to train enough to like beat up a giant man. We watch like Marvel movies and stuff where these like 100-pound women are beating up like 250-pound men.
Yeah.
If you've ever watched any type of competitive combat, like MMA, boxing, wrestling, there's a reason the weight classes are like 6 pounds.
Yeah.
Like wrestling, I think it's 7 pounds. Because the difference in weight is so huge that if somebody's 50 pounds more than you, there's just not much you can like. It doesn't even matter if you trained more, if you're stronger, like physically, like better, I don't know, weight ratio or whatever. They're just bigger and you don't do anything to them. Like you hit them and they don't care.
Yeah.
So when you have like biologically men who are just heavier than women, it makes it relatively easy for a man to overpower a woman because weight's just so important.
Yep.
And then I was thinking about how in an ancient world, like this was part of me, like even learning, hitting adulthood and just realizing how much. So my wife, Melissa, obviously was the one that gave birth to our kids. And there wasn't as much that I could do. And they needed their mom. And it was just like a biological reality of Melissa is taking care of the baby and I do all the other things I can in every single way that I could to help and try to make it as fair as possible. But there's so many times where it's like, can't feed our kid. Like, I don't but it's like, I just can't do that. Those things.
Right. But Melissa's in that time also is then limited on the things that she's able to do too, right? Like her body's physically recovering from this like
months of physically recovering. She's a runner. And so for her, it was so hard because and even that's like this modern thing of like, I am physically in shape. I'm doing this activity that I want to stay in shape for. And we have a lot of athlete students that probably get that. And her frustration was like, if I have a kid, I have a year and a half before I can even hope to get back to where I was. So you take all of that and you go, okay, you're in an ancient world where women are giving birth to children over and over again because more children means bigger family unit, which means more safety. They're nursing, they're caring for, so they're going to be in the home. You're not going out on a hunting, mission when you're having to give birth and take care of children. They're physically smaller. So the men go out and they do those jobs, which then leads to more skill in physical combat because they're used to fighting and defending and that type of thing. So you just end up with a society where men are far more able to hurt and fight. I was thinking about this today I was reading something where it was like men had the right to join the military. And I was like, hold on a second. Maybe this comes from a place of incredible privilege. But if you handed me as a 21st century man, would you like to stay in the home and be with kids or be given a sword and go to near certain death to fight for some king? I would take the home. Like I have a brother who fought in the military, did 2 tours, has incredible PTSD, has told me stories of what like the carnage looks like. And so not saying that it's easy to be the one staying home, but to sell it as like a privilege to get to be the one to go enter into like a bloody conflict.
Right. And I think
that's like wild.
That's even a helpful framework because I think when we think about like what men's roles would have been back then, we just import our like, he puts on a suit and goes to his like 9 to 5,
goes out to a supper club during lunch and
job. I don't know. Like I think that's what we picture, but it's like, no,
there's like there's an army coming.
Like,
you're gonna grab the sword and run and fight whoever these people are, and you're probably gonna die.
Yeah, and it's not like that was just like I think we think of war as like this thing that happens like
a select few who want to get paid a ton go do it.
And like it happens not super regularly. Like there hasn't been like a huge major like draft in our in our lifetime at all. So we think of it as like this optional thing for most men.
Well, even the Ukrainian conflict now is at 1,000 days, which I was like, whoa, that kind of snuck up on me. But I bet they're very well aware.
Yes, we're like very insulated from that. No one, none of our citizens like had to go over there unless they've like willingly chose to be in the military. Whereas we're talking about like, it's not that the man gets to go out and be a boss CEO, like finance bro.
Stay in a 5-star hotel and go with his friends and do things like I'm sure there were, and there were like patriarchy things, like we would call patriarchy, of like negative treatment of women and abuse of power and collecting of resources. And I think that's why when you see the Bible, which we'll kind of get to, of when it denounces all of those negative uses, it starts to paint a different picture, not of saying that men should go get all this privilege, but saying like, hey, there's just these realities in the ancient world of how men and women operated. And then it's giving wisdom and rules within that context.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's just a very helpful frame to go into the passages with. Another one that this scholar said, she was brilliant. She said, men's strength and women's fertility were a resource for the tribe. And to me, that that's so different than the way we think. Like, men's strength and women's fertility is our own inalienable right and privilege to do with as we want in our world. If I have a skill or ability, like I get to do with that. If I want to use that for good or for my family or for my community, I can, but it's my right. I get to choose.
Yeah.
But in that context, like, yeah, to be a man and not fight, to not defend to not go work. Like, that's why, I mean, laziness was talked about actually incredibly negatively in the Bible. Like to maybe really surprising to us. Because that meant you weren't out harvesting when you should, and now your community could die because you didn't get enough food. It wasn't like, oh, you're not doing your homework.
Right.
It was like your tribe is going to die because you're not pitching in and helping. And so, like, I think everybody saw it as we could die at any moment. The world is really uncertain, and so everyone does everything that they can to ensure the survival of the tribe. That included having babies. That included fidelity in marriage. That included going to war. Like, if you could do it, you did it to help people survive.
Yeah.
Leisure is a very new thing. There's like texts from the 1800s talking about leisure. Leisure meaning like doing things just for fun. And so basically every time that you go like, oh, what should I do? That's leisure time.
Yeah.
It's a pretty new thing. And what's sad is all these philosophers in like the 1800s were thinking, I wonder what humans will do with all their leisure. What amazing things they'll accomplish. And it's kind of sad to read them now. And yeah, even my own like squandering of leisure. So the idea is, they're family tribal units who would build alliances through marriage, who everyone would give everything they had to protect the tribe and the people. Otherwise, it led to abuse, death, all of that.
Yeah.
So, which is even interesting with Abraham, which I've never thought about, of how, in some ways, he's increasing the value of the tribe by selling Sarah off, but at the expense of the value of Sarah. Like, he's doing the right. He's doing the right intent. It's like the right intention with the very right. It's like Lot and his daughters, where it's like your job. I should put it this way.
I see.
Yeah, I'm not expressing myself very well. It'd be like somebody who abuses someone to get money for their family because they need money.
Right.
Like, that's not a right thing.
Yeah.
But they're doing what their role is. So Abraham's doing his role in increasing the wealth of his family unit, but not at all the way that God had commanded or had them do it. So it's a like, I think it helps put what he did more in the context of his world. Not that what he did was right.
Yeah.
But that it's not a completely bizarre contextual thing. Giving away a woman in order to receive something for the family unit was kind of part and parcel to what it was to be in the ancient world.
Yeah.
But not your wife.
Yeah.
Like, that's the part where it's like,
Well, and I think that actually is very convicting for me to think about, because I think I do look at that story and say, Abraham's a really bad guy. Which is like still like kind of true, but I think what that contextualizes for me is how alluring doing like something like that would be. Like, it's hard for me to imagine, like, why would you even be tempted to do, like, why would you even be tempted to sell your wife?
Yeah.
Like why, what on earth would even make you think that that's like something that would be a good thing to do?
But given the context, like, I forget this context often, it was a famine.
Yes.
It's not like, I even gave the example of like Elijah doing that, going to the UK. It's not like he's getting a Rolls Royce or a I don't know. Yeah. Like, he's just trying to get rich so he can go live away from his wife. They came from a context where they didn't have enough, like, most of us have probably never been in a situation where there's so little food in the area we live that we literally have to travel for months to get to a new land to get food to eat.
Yep.
So he has like an incredible scarcity mindset. He's worried that he can't provide for anyone. All of these things. So it's like, and so we maybe oversold a little bit of his like selfish desire to just get a bunch of stuff. I'm sure that was still there, but there's a lot more going on in the world and the text than just, simply that. So,
and I think that paints for me also a lot better of like what it means to trust God is that it actually means being in a vulnerable situation and saying, okay, there's this morally bad thing that I could do to like get myself out of this vulnerable, like dangerous, scary
Mhm.
situation. But I'm going to trust what God has said. I'm going to trust what God has said so much that I'm going to say that that's not the right way for me to get out of the
Yep.
situation. The right way is for me to trust that God's going to do something. I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know how he's
Mhm.
going to get me out of this situation, but God's told me that he's going to take care of me.
Yep.
So I'm going to trust that he's going to do that instead of
Morally compromising in order to
Yes.
get the thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast with Josh Garrels, who's a musician that I like.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how he's off of social media. And the example he gave was, he's like, everything in the industry tells you that you need to promote yourself. You need to do these things because they work. And he said, but like Jesus says, take the lowest seat. Proverbs says, let someone else praise your name, not yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, so he's expressing this. He says, as a musician and to provide for my family, there were these things I knew I should do to like increase our wealth and to help take care of them.
Yeah.
But he's like, I ended up deciding that's not the way of Jesus. And so I'm not going to do those things, even if it puts my family in a tough situation. And so that's like interesting, even you saying it, because that's a decision a 21st century musician had to make.
Yeah.
The way of Jesus or like, and trusting God or the way of the world to secure it for yourself. So
yes.
Even though what Abraham did was really wrong, it's part of a continued narrative, which Abraham and Isaac plays off of are you willing to trust God and do what he says or capitulate to the culture to take care of yourself? So yeah, sorry, we're taking way too long to even get into women. And
maybe. So have you set up everything you want? No?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if we should just jump into some specific ones then. We've talked about a decent amount of these. I think maybe we'll jump to women. So if we're talking about how women are treated in the Bible, and does the Bible, like, how does it portray women? How does it talk about them? I think we've talked about Adam and Eve and both being in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth reiterating that is not normal in the ancient world. The idea of saying women were equal, they were created in the image of God, they had value, it's just not normal. They were often seen as lesser than, subservient. So we won't talk a ton about that. I think something I didn't really get to talk about with students when I taught it, I don't know if you did, was the line in Genesis 3 in the curse. I guess it's more the consequences because it's not all a curse.
The rule over.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there's this passage in Genesis.
Yeah, I didn't really talk about this either. Sorry.
Okay, perfect. Well, that's good. We both forgot, or not forgot to. Just you can't talk about everything in the text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So God's giving consequences. Some of them are cursed, some of them are not. So I have to keep reminding myself it's not all necessarily a curse. But as he's talking to the woman, he says, I'll make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor, you'll give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. So the pain part, I think it's pretty clear when you study it that it's about not being able to have children and about grieving and miscarriages and stillbirth. So there's that aspect.
Not only that, but like not only like to birth children, but to raise children. Like, so even if you do have a child, it's like the pain and grief in what it all goes into raising a child in the kind of world you just described. Like it's not an easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's it's not like childbearing used to be painless and now God made it hurt to like punish women as much as it is. Childbearing won't be the fruitfulness is gone. The ease of fruitfulness in the same way it is to the land, it is to humans.
Mm-hmm.
But then this other line, your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. So there's 4, I was going to bring a whiteboard because I find it helpful to show. Oh well. Stevie, can you make us a visual? So there's 4 ways you can read this text. And it depends on whether or not you think these are negative or positive. So there's your desire will be for your husband. So a woman's desire will be for her husband. Is that a good desire or a bad desire? And then he will rule over you. Is that a good rule or a bad rule? So the first option is good, which would be you will want your husband, which you should, and he will rule over you well. He'll be in charge in a good way. And that's just not a possible reading because this is the consequence. Like these are bad things happening. So that one's kind of off the table. They're not both good. So the negative would be, or let's do one of the positive, and let's do those ones first. So you will desire your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. If the desire is good, then what it's communicating is, women, you're going to want your spouse. You're going to desire to be with them, to be around them, to have them care for you. but they're going to be patriarchs in the negative sense in the 21st century. They're going to rule over you. They're going to tell you what to do. They're not going to treat you well. Everything's going to be about them. So that could be one option. The inverse of negative positive would be women, you're going to want to be the man. You're going to want to be in charge. But the husband is the one in charge. So it's a negative desire of the woman. And they connect this to Genesis 4, the crouching, sin, crouching, and desiring for you. So they take those contextual keys and put them together. And I think sometimes it's a reading. I think the female positive, male negative is a reading of patriarchy in our current culture. And I think the inverse is a reading of feminism. Like, I think that's where it seems to often come from, the two. But, and then there's the negative, which I think is that how you read it?
Yeah, that's what I find the most compelling.
Yeah. So the idea is, women, you're going to want to be what you're going to want the things your husband have, and you're going to want to subvert and undermine and manipulate, which we see in the text pretty often. There's just Hagar and Ishmael that happens.
Yep.
And husband, he'll rule over you. Patriarchy. Like, the husband's going to be all about themselves. They're not going to be treating their wives as they should. Abraham. It's like describing Abraham and Sarah and what they're doing. So I think
specifically what Sarah does with the story of Hagar and Ishmael, which you can, I don't know if we're going to talk about that, but
we might get to it, but I don't think so.
You can read it in Genesis 16. I mean, it's kind of sprinkled throughout the Abraham narrative, but it comes to a head in Genesis 16.
Yeah. And again, if you read that with the idea that to have a child is to do your part in providing for your community, it makes more sense why barren women felt so much shame. It was like, I can't help, I can't provide, I can't do anything.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of corollaries to our world of people who feel that way. Like, they can't help other people and they feel very, I don't know, just, incapable and demeaned because of that. So anyway, so there's that story. And then where I wanted to go, because I think when you talk about, it's something we haven't talked about at all yet. So I don't know if it's worth going towards.
So I just want to like sit on that a little bit and like say that basically when we say that we read this as like a negative, what that means for humanity is like men and women are basically in this like giant power struggle. Like that's essentially what this reading like leaves us with, is that men and women who are supposed to be like working together, partnering together, like in order to fulfill the command that God gives them to be fruitful and multiply, like there has to be like men and women like working alongside each other, like for the good of each other and for the world. That's like the beautiful vision. And
the image of God is not complete with just man or just woman.
Yes. That's like the best. That's what it's supposed to be. But instead, like now, instead of men and women like being shoulder to shoulder, like partnering, looking outward, it's like they're like pitted against each other, essentially. Which I
feels
think,
like our cultural moment.
Yes,
so
I think
much.
Explains like
patriarchy versus feminism.
Yes. It explains a lot of like what happens in the Bible between like husbands and wives and like male and female characters in the story of the Bible. And I think it also like really pinpoints, clearly what a lot of people feel living in the world today.
The Barbie movie.
The Barbie movie. Oh my gosh.
Whether you love it or hate it, that is a perfect example of men and women and like, the pittedness against each other. Oh
my goodness. That's.
Don't you think?
I don't know. That was such a like contentious thing, the Barbie movie. We're not like making a statement for or against the Barbie movie.
But that's the idea, is like it's such a contentious thing because it starts to talk about and maybe take sides on certain things about men and women, and that there's a lot going on in people's hearts and minds about it.
Yep.
So one of the places, there's two places I really want to go. We'll see which one we should do. Okay, so here's your options. There's Old Testament laws and explaining, because I think there's a lot of, I had a post that I was like reading where somebody asked like, why when I'm reading the Bible, does it feel like it's demeaning to women? And then there's
Justin researches on Reddit before he comes on this.
I do. No, this isn't actually Reddit. But what I do research, so this is another friendly reminder. The internet is a great place to find a story that you don't know where it is in the Bible. Great idea. Google, where is this story in the Bible? And then go read it. It's also a good place to go to get perspectives outside of your circle. So like I'm in a church. Most of the people I know are Christian. I do have some friends who aren't Christians that I enjoy talking to, but it's not like I don't always sit with them. Like, what do you think about men? And like those really difficult situations. So I do like researching or looking up like when random people go to the internet, because a lot of people use the internet now as like an anonymous way to ask real awkward questions.
Yeah. Yep.
what are those people asking and how are people responding, to try to get some idea of people outside my circle. So that's why I go to it often.
Yeah, no, I was.
You're
that's not
making
meant to be
fun.
a bad thing. That's just.
I get all my theology from Reddit. That'd be horrifying. In the same way, I listen to a lot of like public radio or like secular music with a very discerning, like I try to listen to it and literally go like, like what is this person saying about the world, and what does it say about our world that this person's being platformed and played? And
it's always fascinating. I always laugh so much when you like bring up like secular pop music. It's very funny to me. Yeah, because I like, and this is more revealing about me than it is about you, but I just like, I don't think about it. I'm like, oh yeah, a fun song that's stuck in my head and I like it. And you're like, do you realize
what it's communicating?
What this reveals about their worldview and how they see the world? I'm like, oh, no.
That's just my normal, like, criticalness.
Yeah.
Or just an old man now that does that, sits around and critiques things. So I found this person that responded and they were like, short answer, because the Bible is written by men with an agenda. Long answer, and then it's going on about it, and then it has like, let's take a look at several verses found in the Bible that illustrate this.
Yep, and that's a really like common sentiment that's expressed today.
Yep.
Is the Bible was written by men with not by men who like have the vision of men and women like partnering side by side.
Yep.
It's written by men who have the vision of they're just going to rule over women.
And they need a text to be able, they need God's word to be able to force women to listen to what they're going to say.
Yeah. And obviously that's not what we think, but that is a really common belief that I'm sure students have encountered someone who thinks that.
So this one, a big part of the text that people seem to go to is Old Testament law that seems really negative towards women. And so we could spend some time, because I think there's some really fascinating things about actually what God was doing with these ancient people. The other option that we could do, or you can pick which one, or we could try to do both. The other really interesting one is in 1 Peter 3, there's household codes about how families should operate. And the example given is for women.
Did Elizabeth bring this up to you? Oh, she brought that up to me.
Oh, with Abraham and Sarah.
Yes,
and it's they say be like Sarah.
Yeah.
Who listened to Abraham. Which, if you read the narrative, you're like, what?
Yeah.
Of all the examples, why not Ruth? Why like there have to be other women in the Bible that had husbands that were good to them and listened to them rather than like the one who's like seems to do really badly. Or it'd be like as startling as like be like Bathsheba, who listened to the king, and you'd be like, why would you pick that example? That's a terrible, like that's kind of like how I feel reading that example. So I don't know which one you'd rather jump into first. You turned to that one, so
I mean,
I guess we'll jump into 1 Peter 3.
Let's go there, because
fun fact,
it connects to what we've been talking about too. So
there'll be John and Dave will be preaching through 1 Peter in the winter spring time. So they'll eventually also have to talk about this text.
Yeah, we should send this to them.
Yeah, we should.
Whoever's gonna preach on this.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to read it or I should read it.
Where do you want me to start? First one?
Probably start. Yeah. Well, I want to give a little context for the whole chapter or the whole book, because I think it does matter. So the whole book of 1 Peter is about, I'm actually going to be doing a sermon on the overview of it probably. So
wow,
these are my unformed,
these
are unformed thoughts. It's an entire book about people living in a world that's persecuting them and hurting them. And all of these, like Peter's providing all of these circumstances where Christians are being treated poorly, and how in response to being treated poorly, they should be acting with love and with such high moral character that anyone who is treating them poorly or speaking poorly about them looks like an idiot. Like your life should be so great that anyone doing anything wrong to you should just look foolish. And so it's kind of like the whole context of the book, and that God is the one who will take care of you and provide for you and eventually, carry you, through whatever it is that you're going through. And so then it comes to this section about wives and husbands. And so some of the context could have been, probably was wives who, as we'll see in it, weren't treating or husbands who weren't treating their wives well. So
yeah. Okay.
Which that's like, to me, that's very important context of like than the example that's used. But
yeah.
Not easy, but yeah, sorry.
No, I'm like, okay.
Rereading?
Yeah. Well, I'm reading what comes beforehand too. Yeah, because first they give an example of slaves and how they should conduct themselves, which that's a whole nother question that we'll address on another podcast, is slavery in the Bible and what that means.
Well, did you know? Okay, Lynn Cohick, who's a scholar, her biggest work is on Ephesians, has done a lot of work, and she argues that, like, from what we know of the ancient world, a decent amount, I don't know if I can say a decent, it wasn't uncommon for a man to get a woman as a slave, to lose his spouse, and then for his slave to become his wife.
Mm.
And so some of the contexts, and so slave owners were also patrons. So then you have these women in this really like complicated situation where their husband was their slave master and also is their patron still. And so it like creates all of these like very different cultural situations happening. So having slaves next to wives maybe isn't as demeaning as we think it is, as much as it is like it's the household and it's
and that's a situation that a lot of people were in.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Okay, so wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words and by the behavior of their wives. When they see the purity and reverence of your lives, your beauty should not come from outward adornment. Okay, I read that really weird. Okay, I'm starting over in verse 1. Submit yourselves to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words and by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Should I talk about husbands too?
Definitely.
Husbands in the same way.
Pretty important.
Be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Keep going. Finally,
maybe
all
one
of
more.
you,
Yeah.
be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you are called, so that you may inherit a blessing.
I think 9 is really important, because I think what 9 does is it universalizes repaying evil with good so that you receive in like a bigger context. Because I think you can read the section about women, and it can be hard to stomach. Like, it's hard for me to stomach in the 21st century, a woman being with a man who's not upholding his end of the bargain, because it doesn't feel right to do.
But that's exactly what God does.
Yeah.
Like that's exactly what God does with Abraham, is he upholds his end of the bargain with someone who is not upholding their end. And I actually, for me, that's like actually a really honoring comparison to make, because I think a lot of times what gets thrown around is the Ephesian passage, where it's like, well, why does the husband get to be compared to Jesus and the wife gets to be not? Like, what?
Yeah. Interesting.
Like, what does that say about like the role and responsibility of like a woman or a wife to like emulate godliness? So yes, and that's not to say that that's like I've never been in a marriage that has been like abusive or like
Job Elijah.
Yeah. Elijah is a wonderful husband. But I think to read a passage that does elevate women in that same kind of like comparison that the Ephesians passage does for men, I think is actually a really like
that's really cool. I've never thought
like
of that.
rewarding thing to hear. Anyway,
that's interesting. That is cool. That's a cool, especially because it's a similar household code like we have in a couple of them, where it's like going through the household and how everyone should relate and how different it is from Ephesians. So this one, like when I read it, my reaction was like, why Sarah?
Yeah.
Why would you pick Sarah? But in my mind, it makes sense when you when the context is people who are being treated poorly, people who are being persecuted. Like if the whole letter is to these people who are not being treated rightly, and how the Christian response is to still treat the people who are treating you poorly rightly, to still act honorably, universally. Like we take this one as difficult in its own right, but the whole book is kind of difficult to go. I mean, they could have had an emperor that was executing people left and right, depending on when you date the book. Slaves were pretty universally treated horribly, like to the point where we can't even begin to talk about how bad they were treated. So women might have been some of the best treated people in the examples given of like people who had to treat people, who had to respond graciously or givingly towards somebody who's being bad to them. So
I think the picture in that is always, and this is less about women in the Bible, but something that's really stuck with me from the Bible Project is the hope in Jesus' defeat of death. Is that we can do something that seems impossible. It literally seems like it would be impossible to sit under the rule of a completely unjust ruler, emperor, whatever. It seems impossible to stay in a relationship with someone who is cruel and not someone that you want to be in a relationship with. But because Jesus defeated death, like literally the worst thing in the world, like the biggest power that we would have to fear as humans, Jesus defeated and gives us the same power, not to, and the way that Jesus defeated it was not by refusing to go be crucified, but to submit to that horrible power, ultimately to defeat it. So the way to defeat the evil that we encounter in our own lives is not to overpower it, but to
overcome evil with good.
Yeah,
as the Bible says.
To willingly submit and say, okay, this is not how things are meant to be, but I know that Jesus is going to take care of it. So I can face the consequences of evil in my life and not have to wrangle it myself, because I know that Jesus rose from the dead, which means that he can defeat whatever it is that I'm going through. So I can willingly sit in that. And that's, well, I was
going to say, but that doesn't mean that the Bible advocates, like there are situations where it allows women to leave.
Yes.
Like we've talked about that during the dating season.
Totally. Yep.
That unlike if you were living in a situation where there was the Roman emperor killing people, there wasn't anywhere you could go to escape Rome.
Right. Yeah.
But if a woman was in an abusive or a relationship where the husband left her, abandoned her, or went to another man, then she was allowed to leave. So outside of this text, there's already guards on how bad of a situation this could have been.
That's super true. And helpful.
Yeah. And it's I think it's specifically talking about non-believing husbands. Because it's talking about submitting yourselves to your husband. If any of them don't believe, they'll be won over by your behavior. So I think in some ways it's saying okay, if a woman is married to someone who's not a Christian, which made way more sense as the gospel is spreading, it's less likely now because you can marry a believing spouse, which you should. The idea that don't just treat them horribly because they're not a Christian. They don't follow Jesus, so you should be treating them in a way that then leads them to who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And so it's talking about inner character, which I think that's what's interesting about this text is we can get hung up on the specifics of fine clothes and jewelry or whatever, but ultimately what it's trying to get to is that your inner character matters way more than your outer adornment, which I feel like again gets lost in our world.
Yeah. Do you know? Okay, this is tangentially related, but
this whole thing's a tangent, so
kind of a hobby horse of mine.
Yeah.
In thinking about women and how women are treated, not just in the Bible, but even in Christian culture today, the idea of modesty gets thrown around a lot, and what that does or doesn't look like. And disclaimer: this is not me saying that you should wear whatever kind of revealing clothing that you want. That's not me saying this. But when the Bible is talking about modesty, it's talking about not flaunting wealth. That's almost always what it's talking about when it's talking about how you should dress. It's talking about not flaunting wealth, which I think.
Which is, exactly what this text says.
Yeah, yes.
Wearing
And
gold jewelry or nice clothes.
Yeah.
Or elaborate hairstyles.
Before you feel convicted about whether your clothes are too revealing, feel convicted about
what brand is on them or how much you spent. Or
Yep. Yeah. Which I don't feel like gets talked about enough. That like the clothes that we wear is meant to reflect modesty, not just in the sense of like we're not wearing something super revealing, but in the sense that maybe it shouldn't be like a super identifiable expensive name brand that you're wearing.
Yeah. Yeah, where like artisticness with looks is different than an obsession, fascination, and especially a flaunting of wealth.
Yes. Yeah,
because I think like in a high school or junior high context, that feeds into a lot of popularity, a lot of like being in or out. Yeah, way more than it does revealing clothing.
Yep. I'm looking at you guys in your Lululemon clothes.
Yeah.
Ladies.
Well, and
that's
like
what I'm talking about.
that universalizes it a lot more to guys too. Not that guys shouldn't also dress
totally
modestly in like how much they're wearing, or not. Like less a comment about that and more of, I think that's way more a guy thing too. Of what kind of brand do you have? I remember in high school Oakley glasses, such a thing. So, like Abercrombie and Fitch or something like that. There are like certain clothings that, that's very different.
Anyway, that's tangential, but that's a soapbox that I have. That, I was in like a Facebook group one time, and it actually made me so mad because someone was posting and was being like, "Oh, I bought this like thousands of dollars, like kind of name brand clothing, right?" And they were like, "Oh, but then I read this and I was really confused. Like, should I not be wearing this to church?" And all of the comments were like, "No, girl, you're good. Like, as long as everything's covered up, it's totally fine." And I was like, "What? No, that's literally literally the thing that you felt convicted in reading that is exactly how you should feel in reading that. Like, you should, you should go sell that. Like, I mean, like literally, like tens of thousands of dollars.
That's
kind of
wild.
Clothing. Yeah.
I don't even understand how clothes could be that expensive, but I wear really cheap clothes. So, and personally, because of the way of Jesus, like I don't think I don't know. I'm just kind of an aesthetic in general in those kind of ways. But, it's just my bent as a human being. The husband part's interesting because so you have this context. You have the woman told to be like Sarah, to obey Abraham, and it's weird and problematic. Maybe it makes more sense in context, but it's still kind of strange. It's interesting because it like uplifts Sarah as the noble character, not Abraham, which is...
Well, now that, you know what I'm thinking about now though, is that Sarah did exactly what we were talking about earlier, where Sarah trusted that God would protect her.
And he does.
Yeah, and he does. That's what he does both times.
Yep.
He makes it so that she's not harmed.
Yep.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, and then it makes more sense why he would pick this. Like a husband that's not doing the right thing, but a wife who is like, oh, that actually makes sense why you would pick that person given the context.
Yeah.
But then, and then it makes the husband's part make even more sense to me. We've talked about Sarah being in a vulnerable situation and Abraham increasing that vulnerability. And so in the same breath that it's saying, women, when your husbands are doing this is how you should treat them and what type of person you should be, it then goes to the husbands and says, also, those are not the things you should be doing to a woman.
Yeah.
And that's even how I read like the weaker partner or the weaker like vessel, it's sometimes translated. But I read that not as incapable, but as more vulnerable. Like women are more susceptible to vulnerability. Like that seems to be a broad human thing.
Yeah. And I think in modern culture that seems like an uncomfortable thing to say, but like if you really like had a conversation with someone about it, you would be really hard pressed to find someone who like doesn't actually agree that women are more vulnerable than men.
Yep. And this is always a helpful thing too, to remember that generalities don't mean, so like that men are bigger or stronger than women don't mean that every man is bigger than every woman or stronger than every, like it's a generality. So yes, there are plenty of women who could beat me up. There's lots, and like the list would be very long of women that could beat me up. But that's not what it's saying. It's not saying no woman can beat up a man or no woman can be that every woman is weaker than a man. It's just saying, in general, women are more vulnerable than men. And it's saying treat them as heirs with you. It was interesting because I was listening to a little bit in like the Greco-Roman world. They were talking about how the Jewish culture loved family. And so they had different roles and different ways that they operated between the man and the woman. But the Greco-Roman world, it was about father and sons. And the women, it wasn't about them being family or them being in their role. It was they weren't smart enough, they weren't good enough to be out in public. And so we import that understanding, the Greek understanding, to the Jewish context.
Yeah.
When that wasn't the Jewish context, that was the Greco-Roman context. So they were very explicit. Like, it's so weird too, because I feel like a lot of the like alpha male, like they love the Greek philosophers right now. And that was all the Greek philosophers were like, women aren't as smart, they're not as capable, they're not able to do anything. And then people think, oh, the Bible was the same way. And they're like, no, they were very different contexts.
Yeah.
So you can't, you don't want to conflate them. So I don't know. Do you want to jump over to the laws really quick, or do you just need to be done?
What time is it?
I don't know.
We can keep going.
Deuteronomy 22. Okay. This is going to get a little bit, I don't know how to say it.
Dicey.
Yeah. These are some pretty like tough texts.
Yeah.
Because they're laws about really terrible things happening.
Yep.
So if, in order to frame these, when you're looking at the law, one thing that we have to remember is that we do law very differently than the ancient world did. And again, this is like a thing I've been reminded of, and I forget it so often, that in our world, we have all of this like precedent. And so you can go look and be like, oh, if this thing happens, this is exactly what's going to happen. And you would take it to court, and then eventually somebody would have to make an arbitration, but that an arbitration just means a decision about what should happen. But that decision is normally from previous decisions that were made. In the ancient world, there would have been some type of leader, a tribal leader, a patriarch that would make a decision in a situation. So you see that it actually happens all the time in the Bible, where two people would disagree about something. It's kind of like our jobs, honestly, where like two people would disagree about something. I think of students during a game at youth group, and they come to us and they're like, they cheated, and they're like, we gave you the rules of the game, but we didn't give you every single detail. And so you come to us with like, this doesn't seem fair, or here's the situation. Given the rules you told us, what decision would you make? The ancient world was far more like that, where something would happen and people would have to, a tribal leader would have to make a decision about a situation. So the laws that God gives are guidelines for people to make decisions in specific situations. So it was still the case that somebody would make a decision in a situation and try to take all the factors into case. So that's a good thing to remember. Yeah,
because that's what the Pharisees are doing in the New Testament, essentially, is they're making misguided and wrong decisions, like based off of the parameters of the law.
Or they're forgetting the people. I mean, the example Jesus gives of like, if your ox falls in the mud on Sabbath, are you just going to let it die? Like, no, you're going to save it. And so instead of applying them wisely for the care of people, they're using them as a weapon to hurt people. And so anytime you see a law as a weapon to hurt someone, it's being misused by the people. So Deuteronomy 22:13 is where it starts. So these are so keep in mind all those things about marriage, about it, the connection between families. So it says, if a man takes a wife and after sleeping with her dislikes her and slanders her and gives her a bad name, saying, I married this woman, but when I approached her, I did not find proof of her virginity. Then the young woman's father and mother shall bring to the town elders at the gate proof that she was a virgin. Her father will say to the elders, I gave my daughter in marriage to this man, but he dislikes her. Now he has slandered her and said, I did not find your daughter to be a virgin, but here's the proof of my daughter's virginity. Then her parents shall display the cloth before the elders of the town. I know it's kind of gross and weird. And the elders shall take the man and punish him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the young woman's father, because this man has given an Israelite virgin a bad name. She shall continue to be his wife. He must not divorce her as long as he lives. So you have this first situation where a man takes a wife, and after sleeping with her, and we can see that as like after the wedding night, but I think the case it's trying to make is she's no longer a virgin. So she's not a virgin anymore. And he doesn't want to be married to her for whatever reason. And so he tries to use, he basically tries to get out of the marriage. And so what this does is this actually like, maybe what are your thoughts on this as you?
Well, I think something to keep in mind is this is, again, when family and children were so important. This was essentially what this hypothetical man would be trying to leverage is like, how can I know if these kids are like, this is like kind of a paternity, like this is an ancient paternity test in a lot of ways, is like, because the only way to guarantee that the children that your spouse is having are yours is if your wife is a virgin who has continuously been faithful to you.
There's no paternity. There's no idea of DNA or anything.
Yes. So he's trying to exploit, like, so that's what I'm trying to say is that's part of why it would have been such a big deal for a woman to enter into marriage not a virgin. Not only because like we've talked about in previous teachings, like what sex and sexual intimacy is meant to be for, like a marriage, uniting one man, one woman, all those kinds of things are true. But this is also a way to protect ancient men from, I don't know, raising kids that aren't theirs.
Yeah. And so but in general, this text is a man who's trying to use that system to get rid of a wife he just decides he doesn't like.
Yes. So a law that's meant to protect him, he's trying to weaponize against a random innocent woman.
And it can look weird because it can look like, oh, great, now she has to be married to this man. But to not be married to him would be far worse.
Yes.
She wouldn't be able to remarry. She wouldn't have protection. She's taken out of her father's household. So it again, and we also have to remember that laws are often, they culturally guide. So if you put a law to where there's a punishment for doing, similar, we do this to corporations all the time right now, where if corporations have to behave ethically or we fine them, and the idea is not that the fine necessarily somehow like gets rid of the wrong they did, but it's a punishment to try to pressure organizations to act a certain way. And in a similar way, the idea of this would be, you're going to be out 100 shekels. Like you're going to have to pay again for this wife that you had, and you're still going to be with her anyway. So make sure who you're going to marry, and you're going to stick with that marriage. So it's a law to make sure that women are not passed around and just discarded as soon as they're married.
Yes. Because, for the same reason that it was so important for a woman to be a virgin when she's married is the same reason that she probably wouldn't just be able to get remarried to someone else.
If, however, verse 20, the charge is true and no proof of the young woman's virginity can be found, she shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the man of her town shall stone her to death. She has done an outrageous thing in Israel by being promiscuous while still in her father's house. You must purge the evil from among you. So all of a sudden, you have a woman charged with a capital crime for, in our mind, doing the exact same thing the man did. Like you can look at that, like, okay, he gets a $100 fine. I mean, I think 100 shekels is probably way more than $100. I don't know really much. I guarantee you, $100 to us is not a lot. That's like one bill right now, 4 grocery items. Where she gets stoned to death. I don't know if you have any thoughts, or if you just want me to. This was recently illuminated for me in a very helpful way. So
okay, well then you're probably going to have
by a very wise scholar,
a much more helpful insight than I will. Okay. So take it away.
So what she points out is the man, when we talk to all these things about family and tribe and about how that's protecting the family unit, the man has not actually violated that. Like he's going to stay married. The marriage is still going to hold. The tribes are still going to be held together. He loses money in order to force men to be honorable people, as a way to stop them from doing this practice. But the woman who, if she's found out to not be a virgin, the marriage is off. Like this isn't happening. So now it'd be similar to the adulterous situation of her running off with another man. She's broken the bonds between the tribes. She's, the man literally paid to have her as his wife in a way of the trading of resources. And that'll come up again later. So if you compare verse 19 to verse 20 and 21, it's going to look really unfair, but you have to keep reading. It's a chiasm, by the way, which is kind of cool. So we can read it and compare those two situations, but those aren't being compared. There's a longer chiasm that's actually comparing those situations to situations later, and we'll get to those. So
and a reminder, a chiasm is when different things are running parallel. So there's like an A line, a B line, and then a C line, and then there's like a B prime and an A prime, and the B prime and B are like echoes of each other. And
so verse 22, if a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from Israel. So again, you're like, whoa. So a man sleeps with another man's wife. Like, well, what if he attacked her? Like she just dies? And the next story comes in, or the next law. If a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married and he sleeps with her in the town, it's very important, you shall take both of them to the gate of the town and stone them both to death. You're like, whoa, again, 2 people stoned to death for violating the marriage covenant. The young woman because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man because he violated another man's wife. Which, if you go to the New Testament, John 8, Jesus, part of what they were doing is they brought just the woman to be stoned.
Yep.
And you can't cheat by yourself.
Yeah.
So they didn't bring the man. So they were already picking the woman to punish and not the man. Okay, so you have this situation where a married man and woman a man and a married woman are sleeping together and they must both die. And then you have a man and a woman pledged to be married. So both of these are situations where there's a woman who's already pledged to a man or with a man, and then a man who's having sex with her. 25 helps illuminate a little bit more what's happening in these earlier ones. It says, but if out in the country, a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She's committed no sin deserving death. This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbor. Okay, so what's happening that we often don't pick up on? I remember in seminary learning about this with one of Jesus's parables about the guy who goes and knocks on the friend who knocks on the door incessantly until they're like shamed into answering the door.
Yeah.
We have big yards, and some of you might live in apartment complexes or areas where you're close to your neighbors. A lot of people don't. So we're very isolated from each other. In the ancient world, there were people everywhere. There was no TV. There were no insulated walls. Like if something happened, they would hear you. Like you didn't have privacy. Only the very rich had privacy. So the point would be what this text is getting at is saying it's getting to consent. Like this is the ancient version of consent.
Yeah.
If a woman was attacked, she could scream out and there would be somebody nearby. Because if you're in a city, that doesn't mean the city here where like you're walking through the streets at night and no one will hear you scream. Like it just didn't exist really in the world back then. Houses were really close together or whatever. But if you're in the country, the idea is you're in a spot where no one can hear you when you're in trouble. There's no consent. So it's not perfect. It's not the standard we'd love to say. But what it ends up actually doing is very clearly saying that a woman who doesn't give consent is raped, which for the ancient world is insane.
Yeah. And even, and what's shocking to me about this is like, it even gives the woman the benefit of the doubt.
Yes. Which sometimes is way better than 21st century people do.
Yes. It assumes that basically if this happened in the country, we're just going to, the law just says we're going to assume that the woman was taken advantage of. And she did scream out. She wanted to get away, but there was just no one there to help her. Mm-hmm.
Which is, that's pretty wild.
Yeah.
So the idea that like in the 12th or 13th century or whatever, there was a law protecting women, assuming that women were in the right is so different than any other culture. Mm-hmm. So we can look at this and at first see it really problematically. But remember that what it's giving is guidance to the patriarch or ruler or whoever is in charge. Moses was at some points. Whoever is in charge of deciding what should happen in a situation, giving him the idea of going, so somebody people are coming to you and saying a woman was raped or this man and woman slept together. Where did it happen? Think through what does that mean about whether the woman was consenting or not. Then we go to verse 25. If out in the country a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and he rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. So if you're looking at the chiasm, it's we're not fully done with it yet, but you'll notice now all of a sudden we have a woman pledged to be married. So we had a woman pledged to be married, or a woman, we have these two situations where a woman who's married and a woman pledged to be married, consensual, stone them both. Then you have a woman married and a woman pledged to be married, non-consensual, raped, only stone the man. Mm-hmm. Like they're repeating each other. Mm-hmm. Then we get down, it's very similar things. And then 28, if a man happens to meet a virgin who's not pledged to be married and rapes her and they're discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. that verse has often been taken to mean, okay, the Bible is going to force women to marry their rapists. Several things. The first is it shouldn't be translated rape. So there's an OT professor who's on the council for the NIV who's explaining why this is a really unhelpful translation. Why the parallelism to, like, if you watch the parallel, this is paralleling to the top one where it's
mutually
it's consensual and they're unmarried.
Yeah.
Because she's not, it's a man who in the context wouldn't be married, and it's a virgin who's not pledged to be married. And it wouldn't have been, like, it's already covered rape. So he has sex with somebody and they're discovered. Again, like, even that they are discovered. You're not discovered with somebody raping you. Like, you're discovered with somebody that you're sleeping with before you're married. Like, that's the situation. There's also a parallel, I think it's Leviticus or Exodus. There's a parallel law in Israel's law that's almost identical and does not use rape. And it talks about a man and a woman sleeping together. And the idea is now this woman can't be married off to someone else. You can't create binds. You can't create family units. So they're in this together now. So what this is this is not a picture of a man violently, like, raping a woman and them forcing the woman to marry that man. This is two young adults or teenagers deciding to sleep together, thinking, like, of zero consequences of what's going to happen, and of the law saying, you're now in this. Like, because of the world they live in, you're going to, be together. So.
And again, that's a protection towards the woman. Like, right? Because if all of a sudden now, if she is in the situation from above where she gets married to someone else and the man discovers that she's not a virgin, like if she would have just gone off, she would have grown up to have gotten married. She wouldn't have just grown up to be the cool aunt. Like that's not what would have happened. She would have gone into a different relationship and then would have been at risk of being stoned herself.
Yeah. So if that didn't happen, she'd either never be married, or if she kept it hidden. Yeah. And that's like interesting to think about for women, terrifying to think about. If something were to happen where a woman would lose her virginity in the ancient world and then she were to be married off, which wasn't their choice, when she was discovered, she would be stoned. Like, the husband would then report her, like the law we just saw. So what this is doing is, the parallel passage I was just remembering was seduce. And so it was stopping a man, which we see this in our world still. It was basically stopping men from being able to go and find a young woman, seduce her, convince her to sleep with him, and then walk away
with no consequences.
So this is basically alimony. Like, it's the ancient version of saying men can't just do whatever they want and get away with no consequences. So it's really sad that these verses have been now used to say that the Bible mistreated women, when these are verses about protecting women to make sure that they don't end up in a compromised situation. So, but again, that's really hard to see without knowledge of the context and what marriage meant and what. I don't know where we go from there.
Okay. Is that kind of the last of the verses?
That
you had? Okay.
There's some other stuff, but that's the majority. That's the last of the big pieces. So yeah.
Yes. Maybe why is it the death penalty for like I think we've worked through this like really well, and I think that's, for me, the only question that, or like the tension that remains is like, is it really that serious? Like is it really that serious for someone to like lose their life over this?
There's maybe two different answers to that. One, what's fascinating is, for people who say that the Bible doesn't care about women, it made rape a capital punishment. So if anything, you could say the Bible is too serious about rape.
Right.
But I don't think you can say the Bible doesn't care about women being raped. So like, that's what's fascinating.
No. But I'm even saying like, if a young woman is discovered to not be a virgin, then she's stoned to death. So.
And I think the answer to that one of where she's discovered to not be a virgin would be that she's already broken this, like, she hasn't been raped. It wasn't something against her will because these other laws, and that's obviously that's the intent of it. Like,
right.
People will take advantage of the law all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, a woman could go out into the country to sleep with a man consensually, and then
Right.
she would be innocent. He would get stoned, and it's the woman doing, again, the men and women.
Yep.
So if you have,
Totally.
if the background is men and women not caring for each other at each other's throats, all of these verses can be used to harm
weaponize someone else.
So in that context, the assumption then would be that this woman had gone and slept with someone else, had kept it a secret,
Mm-hmm.
and then she's about to create a bond between two family units, and now she's destroyed everything.
Yeah,
And I think, I don't know if this is right. My best understanding of it, it's still uncomfortable, but my best understanding of it is this woman has put her entire family in jeopardy.
Yes.
And so the reason it's the death penalty is because, which again, we don't live in this world. She could, and they very likely would have caused the death of her whole community.
Yes. And I think that's what I was getting at. Because what we've been talking about a lot is like someone has to take the cost, right? Like if a marriage is a union between these two family units, like you explained, like you talked about from the very beginning, and the consequence of that union to be undermined or dishonest or whatever happened there, then all of a sudden this young man or young woman has put the entire clan, like their entire family, in line for death, essentially. So by that young man or that young woman taking the death, it essentially allows those two families to like be like, okay, it's settled. We've taken care of it. We're not going to be at each other's throats against this.
On either side, whether it's the man or the woman violating that. And that's the thing is, it's anyone violating the marriage covenant and what it does and what it's for puts everyone in jeopardy.
Yes.
Which again is very different from our world, but I literally will never be able to conceptualize like marriage in that way. Maybe if our world like completely collapses and things get really, really bad, but we just live a very like safe life, which is good. Like that's great. I'm very thankful.
We have lots of infrastructures set up by government, society, like there are lots of other things that can help protect and keep vulnerable people safe. But in the ancient world, it was literally only family. Like those are the only people looking out for you in the ancient world. And I mean, to an extent today, like, I mean, hopefully your family's looking out for you. But yeah.
That's crazy. I'd never thought about how we're allowed to make a lot more mistakes. And just in general in the 21st century, it's like if you really mess up over and over and over again, you're still going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, and that just goes back to like there's so much less at stake in our world today. And in Western kind of middle class culture, at least is.
But there are still people in situations where I think of like, say you're a mom or a dad, and especially if you're a single parent and you're working a job and you end up being late or something happens and you end up losing your job. Like maybe some of you, your family has been in that situation, and you know that like if you've ever been in that situation in your household where you didn't have food, your parents didn't have a job, you didn't have a home, you're starting to see like a glimpse of what it would have looked like for those family units to start breaking down. And again, so we can romanticize it and go, so if a woman like runs off with a man or a man runs off with a woman because they fall in love and, you know, whatever, they're going to have to divorce and it's going to be ugly.
That wasn't even their framework for marriage to begin with.
None of that was happening. That's not the situation. This is like
this isn't like but daddy, I love him. Like that's not what's happening here.
No, this is like you have literally like potentially just killed our entire family from the decision that you did. Which again, it reminds me of how much we're all kind of children compared to like people in the ancient world just had to grow up so fast. Man, that's wild.
And that's still true in lots of different parts of the world today.
We're very privileged in that. So
adolescence is only a result of a safe, privileged culture.
Yes. So we may not love exactly what the laws look like in Deuteronomy or how the Bible talks about the stories of women, but what I see over and over again is God taking step towards making women safer, more protected, more valuable in the eyes of society. And that's kind of leads to a book by a guy named Rodney Stark, which I know I've talked to you about before. I don't think on the podcast. It's called a book's called The Rise of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And his argument so he's a sociologist that studied like how did Christianity take off? You have these random Jews in Israel, their leader dies, but it explodes and takes over the entire world. Like how'd that happen? And I'm pretty sure he became a Christian by writing the book. And what he found was the treatment of women, children, and slaves was why it spread.
Yeah.
So to look at the Bible, like just sociologically and historically, it spread because it treated women so well.
Because it treated the most vulnerable so well.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the idea now that we look at it and say it treated them poorly, maybe is just our bad application of the text to our modern world.
Yep.
Or it's bad actors ignoring the text and leveraging them like a weapon to hurt someone. It's the Pharisees just taking the woman. And then I would say like, if you're a man or a woman and you're in a context where a passage about men and women is preached and only one side is really attacked, you're seeing someone use it as a weapon.
Yeah.
You're seeing what the Pharisees did where they brought just the woman up to be punished. So.
Yeah. And
this has been a really like depressing, heavy conversation.
I think it's been very helpful and illuminating. And I think a final thing that I'll say about that is like, be patient and sit with these in the context of the whole of Scripture too. Like I even think about that example that we talked about in 1 Peter, like, and how in that moment for me, it made me go, oh, well, this is like an example of women being kind of given the
Christ role,
so to speak, where in Ephesians, that role is assigned to men. And that's the one that gets talked about the most because it's kind of the most explicitly stated. But that was even like a helpful correction to me in that moment where, because there's always been a piece of me that's like, well, why did dudes get to be the Jesus one? Like, aren't I equally capable of emanating Jesus's character in my marriage or just in my day-to-day life generally? And the answer is yes.
And Peter would say,
and the 1 Peter passage answered that. So yeah.
That's really helpful.
Okay.
Cool. So
we talked, guess how long we talked for?
Hour and 23 minutes.
Oh, you cheated.
Sorry.
Yeah. So this is a long one, but
maybe we'll break it up into 2 parts. I don't know.
We'd have to find a spot to do that in.
We would love your questions.
Devin. Sorry, Stevie. Yeah, I was talking to Isabel this morning. Isabel listens and watches.
Awesome.
So shout out to Isabel.
Yeah. Thanks, Isabel. Give us a question. You have to have. I have questions from what we talked about. You have to. There's got to be something that made you wonder. Or maybe you disagree with us. That would actually be really fun. We won't name you unless you want to be named. No, even if you want to be named, we won't. We're not going to publicly shame anyone.
No.
But
because if you disagree with us, you're wrong, obviously. But
no, if you disagree with us, it's very likely that there's a perspective you have that we haven't either we haven't considered, or we can talk because we're trying to be fast, even though it took us forever. We can gloss over things where there's more nuance than we're able to give it. So that could be where it comes from. So let us know.
Thanks for listening.
This has been Gabby and Justin talking about stuff from the Bible.
Yeah.
To you.
Yep. As always, we'll see you. If you're watching this on Friday, not this Wednesday. It's Thanksgiving. But we'll see you next Wednesday. Bye.
Bye.